So we're going to be looking at this Joint Chief of Staff's document that was recently declassified and is actually in the US National Archives. That's where I've actually accessed it from. And this will really reveal concretely what a weakened state Imperial Japan was in, especially July 1945, not only in terms of its economy, but also equally its military situation. What this document will illustrate is the desperate situation that Japan was in militarily. It had no air force to speak of left, operationally anyway, and its navy was all but at the bottom of the ocean. It had very little striking power, very little defensive capability when it comes to its naval forces and also its air force. It was literally decimated by July 1945. However, having said that, it still had a very sizable ground army which it had been moving from mainland China at the time to reinforce the home islands of Honshu and Kyushu. However, we'll just have a look at this document. It's a screencast again, and I'll highlight the main parts that this Joint Chiefs of Staff's document revealed at the time. And remember, this is all known to President Truman at the time, leadership in the US. So once again, this poses the question, was there actually an alternative to using atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in order to bring Japan to the peace table? Perhaps this could have been achieved if they would have waited a little bit longer, because as the document will reveal, Japan pretty much was on its knees already at that time. Alright guys, thank you very much, and see you soon. Hello everyone, and welcome to this tutorial where we will be looking at briefly Imperial Japan's military and economic situation in July 1945. We'll be looking at this recently declassified document by the Combined Chiefs of Staff, estimate of the enemy's situation, published in 6 July 1945. So this document is very revealing in actually demonstrating Imperial Japan's weak economic and disastrous military situation, which actually it was confronted with a month prior to the atomic bombing. So this raises the question again, was there an alternative open to the United States other than using the atomic bombs to bring Japan to surrender? Would they have surrendered anyway later on, perhaps during the year? Because as the document reveals, Japan was economically on its knees, while equally militarily it was a spent force. Literally, its navy and air force decimated, and its ground force severely lacking in materials and supplies to continue a war for much longer. Let's jump into this article anyway here, and we'll jump to the main parts here. And what I'd like to bring your attention to firstly by looking at this document is the actual situation of the Imperial Japan's armed forces. Okay, here we go here. If we look at the top here, it says sea and air operations have virtually destroyed the capability of the Japanese naval and air forces for other than suicide operations against our forces. So this was very revealing. I found that virtually it didn't have any air force left, let alone any navy, but by July 1945. It had been decimated. There was no serious navy or air force left that Japan could call upon, let alone to wage war continuously. What it did have left was a considerable ground force still, but as this document will reveal, the materials to supply that were virtually non-existent. Moving on then, we can see a blockade and air attacks on productive capacity and concentrating reserves of material are seriously impairing remaining Japanese defensive capabilities. So the sea and air blockade, whether it be from submarine warfare, surface ships, from the constant air attacks that the US had unleashed upon Imperial Japan, had literally decimated its reserves that it had remaining, the material that it needed to maintain and continue this war, and this had impaired its defensive ability and capabilities. The incendiary attacks, as it mentions there, the incendiary attacks on Japanese cities had profound psychological and economic effect on Imperial Japan. So these very destructive air attacks, as you know, a lot of the urban areas in Japan, cities, a lot of the construction was wood, and these are very susceptible to firebombing raids that the United States Air Force unleashed upon Imperial Japan cities, right? Especially in 1945. So mentioning the complete destruction of major areas and all the important war production centers is placing tremendous strain on the residual economy. So what little economy it had left was being literally decimated by these air attacks. So not only had the blockade starved it of bringing in any crucial materials, but whatever industry it had left in mainland Japan was being hammered by the United States Air Force there. Moving on here, if we move to the economic situation, you can see here the Japanese economic position has deteriorated greatly. The resources of the outer zone are no longer available. Now, what that refers to, the outer zone, is the oil fields and rubber plants that had available in Indonesia, Malaysia, and obviously Indochina was still under its control, and parts of Burma. All the materials it was still shipping back was no longer available in order to support its war effort. So it literally been strangulated from all of these materials so necessary, not only maintaining a modern army, but also in the ability for it to launch any offensive or defensive capabilities. Yeah. So this was very revealing, this document, where it actually does go into much further detail regarding production of steel. For example, if you look here, the heavy industry in Japan is currently able to produce only at rates far below the capacity of existing plant facilities. For example, although peak production of steel in the islands of Japan has never exceeded 6 million metric tons, country production is only at a rate of 3,500,000 tons. So production was way down. Production of aluminium, chemicals, fertilizers also hampered by transportation difficulties, as it had no air force available at that time, because it had been literally decimated. What rail networks it had left were being systematically destroyed from the air by the United States Air Force there. Moving on, increasingly heavy air attacks supplementing continued and intensified blockade are seriously reducing Japan's residual production. Okay, once again there it does illustrate the perilous position Imperial Japan was in maintaining a modern armed forces. It was no longer there, no longer had the capacity. Moving on to petroleum, aviation fuel, which we'll move on to in greater depth in another tutorial. But briefly here you can see where it says the Japanese are so short of aviation that fuel that orthodox air operations of a substantial nature in any significant force are improbable. It just didn't have any aviation fuel left to man any serious operations there. So not only did it have hardly an air force to speak of, but it didn't have the ability to even fuel what remained of its air force. So necessary and crucial in any modern armed forces. Right, so this document I chose because I thought it does provide an inside story to the situation that Imperial Japan did find itself in. This is well known by the President of the US and the leadership hierarchy President Truman at the time. All of this was made available to the president and his leadership. Once again raises the question, was there an alternative other than using atomic bombs on Imperial Japan to bring it to surrender? Would it have surrendered later on in the year due to the fact that it had no economy left and virtually no armed forces with regard to its Navy and Air Force? Once again, it did have a substantial land element available. However, it could no way equip it and maintain it for much longer. And this is the document we've just been looking at, the Combined Chiefs of Staff estimate of the enemy situation. And this was available on US National Archives and recently being declassified. Thank you very much, guys, and do take care. We'll be looking at in depth more about the material shortage that confronted Imperial Japan towards the closing months of the Second World War. Thank you very much, and as always, take care and stay awesome.